October 23rd, 1944. The Formosa Strait. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane stood on the bridge of the USS Tang, surrounded by burning Japanese tankers and a freighter charging straight at him through the dark. The submarine was on the surface in the middle of an enemy convoy. There were destroyers on three sides. Pyrotechnics were bursting overhead. Bullets were coming in from multiple directions. Below O'Kane's feet, 4 diesel engines were running at full power. 4 10-cylinder opposed piston diesels turning 4 electrical generators, pushing the Tang at high speed across water lit by burning ships. The engines had not failed once during this entire patrol. They had not failed on any of the 5 war patrols Tang had completed since leaving Mare Island in October 1943. In 1 year, those engines had carried Tang and her crew through 33 confirmed Japanese ship sinkings, more than any other American submarine in the war. Over 116,000 tons of enemy shipping, 2 presidential unit citations, a Medal of Honor for her commander. Tang's 3rd war patrol, into the Yellow Sea in June 1944, sank more enemy ships than any other single American submarine patrol of the entire conflict. And the engines that made all of that possible, 4 1/600 horsepower diesels in a cramped engine room, had been built by a company that, 15 years earlier, was best known for manufacturing weighing scales. The same company that had once been the largest seller of windmills in the American Midwest, a factory in a small Wisconsin town that had never built a warship engine before 1938, a factory whose roots went back to 1823, to a Vermont inventor who had patented a cast iron plow. When the Navy first walked into that factory in the 1930s, looking for anyone, who could build the kind of diesel that submarine warfare would soon require, naval engineers had their doubts. A windmill company? A scale manufacturer? Building engines for fleet submarines that would have to start every time, every day, on patrols that ran 60 days at a stretch in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. By the end of the war, the engines from that factory would be running in fleet boats from Pearl Harbor to the South China Sea. They would be the engines beneath Mushmorton on USS Wahoo, the engines beneath O'Kane on the Tang, the engines beneath Pampanito when she pulled 73 oil-soaked Allied prisoners of war out of the South China Sea on September 15th, 1944. After one of the most heartbreaking chapters of the entire submarine war. Today, we're going to walk through how it happened. How a company that built scales for grocers in 1830 ended up powering the boats that strangled an island empire. How the wrong choice of engine builder nearly cost America the Pacific Submarine War in its earliest months. And how the right choice, the unlikely choice, the one almost nobody believed in, saved it. This is the forensic walkthrough of the engine they doubted, the factory they didn't trust, and the men who went to war on the diesels that came out of Beloit, Wisconsin. Part 1. The problem that had no solution. To understand why the Navy was eventually desperate enough to walk into a windmill factory, we have to go back to 1932. In 1932, the United States Navy had a problem that nobody on Earth knew how to solve. Submarines were changing. The old gasoline-electric boats from World War I had been dangerous, unreliable, and frankly, terrifying things. Gasoline fumes inside a sealed steel tube full of sailors had killed men in horrifying ways. Boats had exploded at the dock. Crews had suffocated in their bunks. The Navy wanted out of gasoline. The future was diesel. Diesel was safer, more efficient, and more powerful. A properly designed diesel-electric submarine. Diesels on the surface charging batteries, electric motors underwater, could go further, stay at sea longer, and carry more torpedoes than any boat in human history. Its problem was simple to state and brutal to solve. The diesel engines that existed in 1932 didn't fit. They were too heavy, they were too slow, they were too tall, they produced too little power for their weight. The state-of-the-art in diesel technology, refined over decades for railroads and ships, simply could not be crammed into the cylindrical pressure hull of a submarine at the horsepower required, in the numbers required, at the reliability required. Admiral S.M. Robinson, who took over the Navy's Bureau of Engineering in 1931, understood the math. He laid down two requirements that sound simple and turn out to be devastating. 1, the engines had to be light. 2, they had to be designed for mass production. That second requirement is the one most people miss. Submarines were not yachts. The Navy wasn't going to build a few boats. If war came, and Robinson believed it would, they would need dozens, eventually hundreds. Each fleet's submarine would carry 4 main engines plus an auxiliary. 100 boats means 400 main engines, and every one of them needed to be virtually identical. A piston liner pulled out of one engine had to drop into another engine on a different boat at a different Navy yard without filing or grinding. In 1932, no engine like that existed, so the Navy did something unusual. They went hunting. In 1932, the Bureau of Engineering signed development contracts with 5 different companies for new submarine engine designs, not because they wanted variety, because they wanted survival. They needed multiple options, multiple designs, multiple suppliers. Of those 5 contracts, only one design survived the brutal testing program at the U.S. Naval Engineering Experiment Station in Annapolis. That winning engine was built by the Winton Engine Company, a firm General Motors had quietly purchased in 1930 and which would soon be reorganized as the Cleveland Diesel Engine Division. The Cleveland-Winton design became the prototype for the engines installed in the Navy's first true diesel-electric submarines, the Porpoise, Pike, Shark, and Tarpon. By the time war came, GM's Cleveland Diesel Division would produce roughly 70% of the diesel engines used in U.S. Navy submarines during World War II. Over 13,640 engines from a single division during wartime. They were good engines. They were the workhorses of the early Pacific Submarine War. But here's what nobody fully appreciated in 1932. One supplier was not enough. This is where the title's promise begins to take shape. The Navy didn't just need an engine, they needed a backup. They needed redundancy. They needed multiple companies capable of building submarine-grade diesels in case one factory was disrupted, one supply line cut, or, and this is the part nobody at the Bureau of Engineering wanted to say out loud, in case one supplier produced something that didn't actually work. So, in addition to the Cleveland deal, the Navy turned to 2 other companies. One was a firm called Hooven Owens Rentschler, HOR, based in Hamilton, Ohio. Through a corporate arrangement involving the General Machinery Corporation, HOR was licensed to build a German-designed double-acting diesel engine that promised nearly twice the horsepower of conventional designs in the same physical envelope. On paper, it was the most exciting engine in the entire program. The other company was a firm most naval officers had never thought of in connection with warship engines, a Wisconsin manufacturer, best known across America for selling weighing scales, the kind that weighed cattle and bales of cotton in every county courthouse. Best known across the West for the Eclipse windmill, the wooden, durable water pump that dotted the landscape from Texas to the Dakotas to as far away as Australia. Best known to farmers and small-town merchants for stoves, pumps, feed mills, coffee grinders, even radios. A naval engineer reading the file in Washington might have looked at that company's product line and asked the obvious question, Why is the United States Navy asking a windmill factory to build engines for warships? But the file went through. The contract was signed. And in Beloit, Wisconsin, a company called Fairbanks, Morse and Company quietly began the work that would eventually change the Pacific War. The Cleveland engines would be the workhorses. The HOR engines would be the gamble. And the Fairbanks Morse engines from the windmill factory, those almost nobody yet knew, would turn out to be the difference between a long, brutal Pacific submarine war and one the United States could actually win on a reasonable timeline. But to understand why, you have to understand what was about to go catastrophically wrong with the gamble. Because the HOR engines weren't just disappointing, they were a disaster. We'll get to that. But first, we have to talk about who Fairbanks Morse actually was, because the answer is stranger than the contract suggests. Part 2. The Windmill Factory. The history of Fairbanks Morse and Company starts in 1823 in the small Vermont town of St. Johnsbury. A Vermont inventor named Thaddeus Fairbanks opened an ironworks. He patented a cast iron plow in 1826 and a heating stove. Neither was the thing that built the empire. In June 1832, Thaddeus Fairbanks patented something called the platform scale. It sounds boring. It was world-changing. Before the Fairbanks scale, weighing large objects, bales of hemp, sacks of grain, livestock, freight, was difficult, inaccurate, and trusted by nobody. The Fairbanks platform scale used an arrangement of levers that allowed a small counterweight to balance enormous loads with stunning accuracy. Within a generation, the firm of E and T Fairbanks and Company was selling Fairbanks scales not just across the United States, but in Europe, in South America, and in Imperial China. Fairbanks scales won 63 medals over the years in international competition. Charles Hosmer Morse joined the firm and opened a Chicago office. He had a gift for absorbing useful businesses. He brought a former missionary named Leonard Wheeler, whose Eclipse windmill was already becoming a feature of the American landscape, into the Fairbanks Morse fold. Wheeler had set up shop in Beloit, Wisconsin, just after the Civil War. By the late 1800s, Eclipse windmills were pumping water on roughly 500,000 American farms, with more sold to remote sheep stations in Australia. By the end of the 19th century, the company was Fairbanks Morse and Company, headquartered in Chicago, with its main engine works in Beloit. This was the company that would, 50 years later, build the engines for fleet submarines. A scale company, a windmill company, a pump company, a company that had, by the early 1900s, gotten into the gas engine business, initially just to provide backup power for windmills on calm days. The engines worked. By 1913, Fairbanks Morse was making semi-diesel engines. By 1924, they had built the WWII, the first American-designed full diesel produced without a foreign patent. The Beloit plant grew. Fairbanks Morse engines started turning up in sugar mills, rice mills, oil fields, ferries in the Philippines, and remote power plants from Mexico to Australia. They knew engines. But submarine engines? Warship engines? That was a different world. In September 1933, two Fairbanks Morse engineers, Heinrich Schneider and Percy Brooks, filed a patent for what would eventually become the Model 38 opposed piston diesel. The design was unusual, 2 pistons in each cylinder moving toward each other with combustion happening in the middle, 2 crankshafts, one above and one below, geared together. No cylinder head, 2-stroke operation. Fewer moving parts than a conventional engine and a much higher power-to-weight ratio. The Germans had been working on opposed piston engines too. Junkers had built an aircraft diesel called the Jumo 205, also a 2-stroke opposed piston design. The Junkers engine was eventually abandoned for aircraft use because of its weight and its narrow power band. But for marine applications, where weight constraints were less severe and continuous duty operation was the norm, the opposed piston principle was potentially revolutionary. In December 1934, the Navy took a chance. The Bureau of Engineering ordered 8 Fairbanks-Morse Model 38A8 engines, 4 for the USS Plunger, 4 for the USS Pollock, both Porpoise-class submarines being built at that time. The first 38A8 engines were rough. The chain drive on the upper crankshaft caused problems. Vibration was a constant question. The Beloit engineers went back to the drawing board. By 1938, a new version had emerged, the 38D818. The chain was gone, replaced with a more robust gear train. The frame was welded steel rather than cast iron. The cylinders had an 8 1/8-inch bore and a 10-inch stroke per piston. The engine could be built in 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 12-cylinder configurations. The 9-cylinder and 10-cylinder versions, producing roughly 1,600 horsepower each, were the ones the Navy wanted for fleet submarines. Naval experts looked at the design and at the company building it. Their doubts were not irrational. An opposed piston engine had never powered an American submarine in combat. The company building it had never built a warship engine. The basic design had been inspired by a German aircraft engine, and there were officers in the Bureau of Engineering uncomfortable about anything traceable to junkers. Could a windmill company really deliver something that would survive submarine duty? Could they build it in the numbers a Pacific War would require? In early 1940, with the war in Europe already raging, the Bureau of Ships went a step further. They asked Fairbanks-Morse to design a 3,000 horsepower opposed piston engine for a future submarine class. Robert Beadle, the head engineer at FM, accepted the assignment. The result was the FM Diamond engine, 4 banks of 6 opposed piston cylinders arranged in a literal diamond configuration, 24 cylinders in total. The Diamond engine would not see combat in time, but the assignment told the Navy something important. Beloit was thinking forward, not backward, and then the news came in that turned cautious confidence into urgent dependence. The HOR engines were failing, not in some vague, manageable way. Catastrophically. Men like the Fairbanks-Morse engineers in Beloit didn't fight for medals. They built engines for boats they would never see, for submariners they would never meet. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps that history visible, the part that lives in patents and production records and the engine room logs of boats that came home. And that matters, because the disaster is what made the windmill factory indispensable. The disaster involves a submarine sitting at Mare Island for over 8 months. It involves a captain whose words about the HOR engines became one of the most famous quotations in submarine history. And it involves the moment the Navy realized the company they had once doubted was now the company they were going to need. Part 3. The Catastrophe. The HOR engine was supposed to be the breakthrough. Hooven Owens Rentschler, headquartered in Hamilton, Ohio, had picked up a license for a German double-acting diesel design. Double-acting meant exactly what it sounds like. The piston worked on both sides. Combustion above the piston and combustion below the piston, with a piston rod passing through a sliding seal at the bottom of the cylinder. Twice the power, in theory, in the same physical envelope as a conventional engine. The original double-acting design came from MAN, the German engineering firm. The cruiser Leipzig used a similar engine. HOR modified the design, 8 cylinders, then expanded to 9 for the submarine version, producing 1,535 horsepower at 700 RPM. The power-to-weight ratio looked excellent on paper. The Navy was intrigued enough to award HOR contracts for engines that would go into a portion of the new submarine fleet. The first submarine to receive HOR engines was USS Pampanito, SS-181, a Porpoise-class boat launched on March 11, 1937 at Mare Island Navy Yard. When her sea trials began in late 1937, something extraordinary happened. She didn't even make it out of the Navy Yard. All 4 engines wrecked themselves due to excessive vibration and improperly forged gearing. The engines tore themselves apart at the dock. The engines had to be removed and shipped back to Hamilton, Ohio. There, on the test stand at the HOR factory, they failed again. Pampanito sat at Mare Island for over 8 months, immobile, useless, while the Navy and the company worked through the failures. The engines were eventually rebuilt and reinstalled. Through extraordinarily careful maintenance, the crew coddled them along until 1942, when wartime resources finally allowed them to be replaced. Other boats got HOR engines too. USS Salmon, 12 Gatto-class submarines built at Electric Boat from SS-253 through SS-264. The HOR engines kept failing in the same patterns. Excessive vibration, gear teeth shedding under load, drivetrains shaking themselves into uselessness. A Navy investigation eventually concluded what was happening at the metallurgical level. The steel used for the timing gears was incorrectly manufactured. The chemical composition was right, but the grain structure of the steel contained microcracks, caused by being cooled too rapidly at the steel mill, that made the gears fail under the high torsional loads imposed by the inherently unbalanced double-acting design. Combined with the vibration produced by the imbalance between the 2 sides of each piston, the piston rod reduced the effective area on one side. The gears overstressed, shed teeth, fed back vibration into the rest of the drivetrain, and rendered the engines inoperable. Submarine crews started calling the HOR engines something else, based on the abbreviation, based on what the engines did to the men who had to live with them. Naval shipyard people referred to them openly as whores. The nickname found its way into Clay Blair's classic submarine history, Silent Victory. The most famous quotation about the HOR engines came from Captain Tommy Dykers, commanding officer of USS Jack. Dykers, looking back on the early Pacific War, said something that has appeared in submarine history accounts ever since. He said the HOR engines saved the Japanese 30 or 40 ships. Think about what that meant in practice. Submarines that should have been at sea, hunting Japanese tankers, sinking Japanese convoys, were sitting at piers with their engine compartments torn apart, or they were limping home with 2 of their 4 engines disabled. Captain Charles Herbert Andrews of USS Gurnard, recalling a war patrol in support of Operation Torch in late 1942, said about his HOR boat that he only used 3 engines, saving the 4th as a spare, not for emergencies, for when one of the other 3 failed, because they were going to fail. The Pacific Submarine War in those early months was being fought with one hand tied behind the Navy's back. Boats that should have been on patrol were in the yard. Skippers who should have been hunting were waiting for parts. And the Japanese merchant marine, the supply lines that kept the imperial war machine running, was getting through. By early 1943, the Navy made a decision. Every HOR engine in every American submarine would be replaced at the first opportunity. All of them. The replacements would come from one of 2 sources. Either General Motors' Cleveland diesel model 16278A VI-type engines, or Fairbanks Morse Model 38D 818 opposed piston engines. This is the moment the windmill factory became indispensable. Cleveland diesel was already running flat out. By 1939, 98% of Cleveland's business was government work. Their factories employed 5,000 people during the war. They were the Navy's primary submarine engine supplier. But Cleveland alone could not meet the demand. Not when every HOR-equipped boat needed to be repowered. Not when the Beloit class was about to launch in unprecedented numbers. Every Fairbanks Morse engine that came out of Beloit was now an engine that could go into a fleet boat that desperately needed one. The Beloit factory was no longer a backup supplier. It was one of the two pillars holding the entire submarine fleet upright. And the men running those engines started to talk about the difference. The Cleveland engines were powerful and well built. The Fairbanks Morse engines were narrow. They fit beautifully in cramped engine rooms, and they were forgiving. The opposed piston design, with no cylinder head to remove, gave easier access for at-sea maintenance than a conventional V-type. Crews liked them. Skippers trusted them. The Pacific Submarine War was about to enter its most successful phase. American submarines were about to start sinking Japanese tonnage at a rate that would, by the end of the war, account for 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the conflict, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. The boats had become the instrument that would strangle an island empire, and every one of those boats, every Wahoo, every Tang, every Pampanito, was running on engines from companies that, 10 years earlier, the Navy had not yet trusted. The HOR engines had been the gamble. The gamble had failed. The windmill factory had become the answer. But the question that hangs over the rest of this story is one of scale. How does a company that in 1934 was best known for scales and pumps and farm equipment go from delivering 8 test engines to running a wartime production line that fed an entire fleet? The answer involves Beloit, Wisconsin in 1942. It involves a workforce that, by 1944, was largely women, and it involves the most famous American submarine commander of the early war. Part 4. Beloit Goes to War. In 1942, Beloit, Wisconsin, was a small Midwestern industrial town along the river. The Fairbanks Morse plant sprawled across both banks. The men who had built engines there before the war were leaving for the military as fast as the draft and enlistment forms could process them. And as they left, something extraordinary happened on the shop floor. The women came in. The official Fairbanks Morse Defense corporate history acknowledges it directly. With most of the men at war, women took over manufacturing. They ran the lathes. They assembled the cylinder banks. They worked the welding torches that built the engine frames. They torqued the bolts on engines that would, weeks later, be installed in submarines on their way to Pearl Harbor and Brisbane. The numbers tell the story. Nearly 3,100 engines built at the Beloit facility for U.S. Navy submarines and surface ships during the war. The plant ran at a rate of approximately 1 finished engine per day. The factory trained hundreds of Navy sailors how to operate the engines they would soon take to sea. Fairbanks Morse ranked 60th among all U.S. corporations in the value of military production contracts during World War II. Think about the scale. 1 engine per day. Each engine roughly 80,000 to 100,000 pounds, depending on cylinder count. Each engine containing thousands of precision-machined parts that had to be interchangeable with parts from any other engine of the same model. Each engine destined for a submarine where every man aboard would depend on it functioning correctly during a depth charge attack, 400 feet below the surface of the Pacific. The engines went on to fleet boats. The Beloit class, the largest single class of American submarines with 120 boats built, received either Cleveland 16 278A Phi types or Fairbanks Morse 38D opposed piston engines. The Tench class, the late war improvement, the same. The earlier Gatto-class boats that had received the disastrous HOR engines were being repowered, often with engines that had come out of the Beloit factory the previous month. USS Pampanito, a Beloit-class boat commissioned at Portsmouth Navy Yard in November 1943, received four 10-cylinder Fairbanks Morse 38D818 engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower, plus a smaller 7-cylinder model 38E5 1 or 4 auxiliary engine for the ship's service generator. The engines were started by compressed air. They idled at 300 RPM with a governor-imposed limit of 400 RPM. They turned electrical generators that fed the boat's electric motors and charged the batteries. In the engine rooms of those boats, the noise was beyond ordinary description. Crewmen aboard Pampanito reported that on the surface, even at standard speed, the engines were so loud that men in the engine room could only communicate by hand signals. The main air induction supplied fresh air into the compartment, and the diesels, consuming massive quantities of air for combustion, created a strong, continuous breeze through the engine room. The boat carried up to 110,000 gallons of fuel, which was pumped through a centrifugal purification system before reaching the engines, allowing the crew to use whatever bunker fuel they could find at remote bases. Refined diesel was scarce. The engines didn't care. This was what was happening below the deck plates, while the war was being fought above. When USS Wahoo, under Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, made her famous third war patrol in January 1943, engines from this lineage were turning the generators that gave Wahoo her speed and her endurance. Wahoo was a Gato-class boat. Morton took her into the Japanese-held harbor at Wewak on the north coast of New Guinea using, by his motor machinist's mate's account, a school Atlas bird dog Keeter had bought cheaply in Australia, because the boat had no proper chart of the harbor. Morton fired a down-the-throat torpedo at a charging Japanese destroyer that came within yards of the periscope. Then he fought a 14-hour running battle with a 5-ship convoy, sinking 3 of them and damaging the others. He brought Wahoo home to Pearl Harbor with a broom strapped to the periscope shears, the traditional sign of a clean sweep, the first American submarine to wipe out an entire convoy single-handedly. Morton was a different kind of submarine commander. Before that third patrol, he gave a brief speech to his crew that became part of the legend of the Pacific Submarine Force. He told them the Wahoo was expendable. He told them any man who wanted to leave the boat had 30 minutes to notify the yeoman. There would be no negative word said about anyone who chose to go. None of the crew accepted his offer. They went to sea with him knowing what he intended to do. Morton sank 19 ships in his patrols on Wahoo. Wahoo never returned from her 7th patrol. She entered the Sea of Japan in early October 1943. On October 11th, an anti-submarine aircraft caught a surfaced submarine in La Perouse Strait and dropped 3 depth charges. Wahoo's wreck was discovered in 2005, struck in the conning tower by a bomb. All 79 men aboard were lost. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, the Pacific Submarine Force commander, wrote that the loss simply did not seem possible to him. But Morton's school of submarining lived on. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, was given command of USS Tang in October 1943. Tang was a Beloit-class boat. In 5 war patrols, she would sink 33 Japanese ships, totaling more than 116,000 tons, the highest tally for any single American submarine commander in the entire war. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor for the actions of October 23rd. In 1944, when Tang attacked 2 heavily escorted Japanese convoys on consecutive nights, breaking into the middle of formations and destroying multiple ships at point-blank range. Tang was lost on the night of October 25, 1944. Her last torpedo malfunctioned, broached the surface, and ran in a circle, striking Tang in her own stern about 20 seconds after firing. The submarine sank. Of 87 men aboard, 9 survived to be captured by the Japanese. Some of them escaped from the sunken submarine using Momsen lungs. the only documented successful Momsen-Lung escape from a sunken submarine in U.S. naval history, O'Kane was captured. He spent the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps. He came home in 1945 to receive the Medal of Honor from President Truman. If your father, grandfather, uncle, or great-grandfather served on a fleet boat in the Pacific, or worked at the Beloit plant, or at the Cleveland factories, or at any of the places where this kind of war machine was actually built, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What boat? What patrol? What engine room? What watch? Those details matter more than any archive. The names matter, and they are slipping out of living memory year by year. But there is one more chapter that has to be told. Because the engines from Beloit didn't just power the boats that fought the war, they outlasted the boats themselves. They outlasted the war. And in a strange consequence that nobody at Fairbanks Morse could have predicted in 1938, the engine the Navy had once doubted, the design from the windmill factory, would still be the engine the United States Navy depended on decades after the last fleet submarine had been retired to a museum pier. Decades after most of the men who built it were gone. Decades after most of the men who took it to sea were gone. Part 5. The engine that outlasted the war. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, the United States Navy had built, in roughly 4 years, the largest submarine force the world had ever seen. American submarines had destroyed 1,214 enemy vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war went down to American submarine torpedoes. The Pacific Island Empire had been strangled by boats that hunted alone, often weeks from any friendly port, running on diesels that had to start every time, every day, for 60 days at a stretch. When the war ended, what was the immediate consequence for Fairbanks Morse? Demand collapsed. The Navy had thousands of essentially new engines in inventory. Surplus engines flooded the post-war civilian market. Cleveland Diesel, which had grown to 5,000 employees during the war, dropped to 1,000 by 1947. For a few years, it looked like the boom was over, but the engines stayed in service. And here is where the Fairbanks Morse story takes the turn that nobody could have predicted in 1938. Starting in the late 1940s, the Navy began a program called GUPPI, Greater Underwater Propulsion Program. Inspired by the captured German-type Beloit U-boats, GUPPI conversions streamlined the wartime fleet boats. It gave them snorkels, improved batteries, modernized fire control. Through the 1950s, dozens of American submarines went through GUPPI conversion. Their Fairbanks Morse engines stayed. In the early 1950s, the Navy designed a new diesel-electric submarine class called the Tang class, named after O'Kane's lost boat. The Tang-class boats were shorter and more compact than the wartime fleet submarines. They needed a more powerful engine packed into a smaller space. The Navy chose a pancake engine, the General Motors EMD 16338, a vertical crankshaft radial design with cylinders stacked in tiers. It was innovative. It was compact. It didn't work. The pancake engines failed in submarine service. The demands of submarine duty, the constant starts and stops, the seawater cooling, the long patrols, the extreme reliability requirements were beyond what the design could handle. By the late 1950s, the Navy had a problem that sounded eerily familiar. They needed to replace failed engines on submarines that should have been at sea. Their solution? The same Fairbanks Morse 38D 818 engines that had been pulled from the wartime drawings. Beloit was still building them. The opposed piston engine that the Navy had doubted in 1934, the one from the windmill factory, the one nobody was certain about, was now the proven, trusted, dependable choice. It was retrofitted into the Tang-class boats, It went into the Barbel-class submarines, the very last conventional attack submarines the U.S. Navy ever built. USS Blueback, SS 581, commissioned in 1959, decommissioned in 1990, the last diesel-electric attack submarine in active U.S. Navy service, ran on Fairbanks Morse 38D 818 engines for her entire career. She is now a museum ship at OMSI in Portland, Oregon, but it didn't stop there. When the Navy went nuclear, the new boats, Los Angeles class, Seawolf class, Ohio class, needed backup diesel generators. Something to run essential systems if the reactor was scrammed. Something reliable. Something that would start every time, even after sitting unused for months. The Navy chose the Fairbanks Morse 38ND818, a slightly modernized version of the same design from 1938. Read that again. Nuclear submarines built in the 1980s and 1990s, boats so advanced they made the WWII fleet boats look like steam locomotives. Carry as their emergency backup power an engine whose direct ancestor was designed in 1938 by a windmill company in Wisconsin. The same opposed piston configuration, the same basic architecture, the same factory in Beloit where Charles Hosmer Morse had once organized the sale of platform scales. The 38-818 has been in continuous production since 1938. USS Pampanito sits today at Pier 45 in San Francisco, a memorial to the 52 American submarines that remain on what the submarine force calls eternal patrol. Her 4 Fairbanks Morse 38D engines are preserved. Volunteers, many of them retired Navy submarine veterans, still maintain them. According to those who keep her running, parts are still available. You can call Fairbanks Morse Defense in Beloit, give them the model number and the serial number off the engine plate, and they will help you keep the 1943 engine running. The manufacturer rates the modern Fairbanks Morse OP 38D81/8 for a 40-year service life, but plenty of WWII-era examples are still in periodic operation more than 80 years later. There is one more strange chapter. The Soviets, after the war, somehow obtained a Fairbanks Morse 38-818. They reverse-engineered it. They built their own version and called it the 2D100. They installed it in the TE-3, which became the first mass-produced Soviet diesel locomotive, over 7,600 units built. The opposed piston engine, designed in Beloit, Wisconsin, became, in an unintended consequence of the Cold War, the workhorse of Soviet rail freight. Many descendant locomotives are still in service today across Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. Here is the verdict. The men and women who built the engines in Beloit during the war, the women who took over manufacturing as the men left, the engineers like Schneider and Brooks and Beadle, the trainers who taught Navy sailors how to overhaul the engines at sea. They built something they could not have understood the full scope of. They built engines for boats they would never see, for crews they would never meet, for missions they would never know about until the war was over. The Navy had doubted the windmill factory in 1934. They had doubted the opposed piston design. They had doubted whether a Wisconsin scale company could deliver in the numbers a Pacific war would require. They had been wrong on every count. By 1945, those engines had powered the boats that strangled Japanese shipping. By 1965, those engines were still running in the last diesel-electric attack submarines in service. By 1995, those engines were the emergency backup on the most advanced nuclear submarines in the United States Navy. By 2025, those engines were still being made in Beloit, Wisconsin, by a company descended directly from the Vermont scale maker who had patented a platform balance in 1832. The menace of the Pacific submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service in World War II. Roughly 1 in 5 did not come home. 52 American submarines remain on eternal patrol, their final positions unknown in many cases. their crews unrecovered. Mushmorton went down with Wahoo on October 11th, 1943. Richard O'Kane survived 10 months in Japanese prison camps before coming home to receive the Medal of Honor from Harry Truman on March 27, 1946. The men of Tang, who escaped through the forward torpedo room using Momsen lungs, survived their captivity and the war. The engines from Beloit stayed. If you found this forensic walkthrough valuable, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about getting the history right, not just the headline version, but the part that lives in patent filings and production records and the engine room logs of boats that came home. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there is more to tell about the men, the machines, and the places where the Pacific War was actually won. The factory the Navy didn't trust ended up indispensable. The engine they doubted ended up in nearly every fleet boat that mattered. And the men who went to war on those boats, many no longer with us, all of them deserving better than to be remembered only as a number in a tonnage report. Their names matter as much as the engines that brought most of them home. War is metallurgy and chemistry and mass production. It is patents filed in 1933, and women working second shift in 1944, and engineers at sea, in the dark, listening for a piston that suddenly isn't quite right. But the men and women who fought it, in factories and in fleet boats and in everything in between, were not engines. They had names, and they deserved to be remembered by them.